Okay, here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. If this happens to be your first time listening to the show, let me welcome you. Everyone else, what's up? How are we doing? Does anybody know? And I don't mean that on an individual level, because I'm hoping that we're all doing a bit of yoga practice and able to go inside ourselves and have some sense of how we're doing as individuals. But I'm asking on a more collective level, because I don't see any stabilizing happening. And maybe it was naive of me to think that things would start to stabilize over time. Everyone keeps saying we're not going back to normal, and we are certainly learning that on a daily basis. Here in my country, we've got federal agents tear gassing moms who are peacefully protesting. And like I was talking about last week, everybody's trying to figure out if it's okay to send their kids back to school. It's all so confusing. Like I said, it just feels like everything is boiling over, including me right now, because I'm in my attic and it's ridiculously hot and I'm sweating. And I'm just feeling terribly out of sorts. Not just because the world's falling apart and because it's hot, but because yesterday they pulled my tooth out. If you've been listening, you heard me talking about this infection I had in my tooth. Well, yesterday they extracted it. And my dentist did a fantastic job. She numbed me up very good, so it didn't hurt while she was doing it at all. But as that Novocaine wore off throughout the day, oh boy, could I feel it. And you know what the craziest part is? The sound. The sound of someone pulling your tooth out is crazy. But I'm glad to be addressing it finally. And in a couple of weeks, they'll go and fit me for the bridge that's going in. But today I feel really tweaked, It's a strange state to be in, to have had my tooth pulled out. Sort of an interesting kind of metaphor. Let's just say I'm not in an optimal place to be recording this right now. But it's fine, because last week I did like a major check-in if you were here. And I have an amazing talk to share with you today with Amy Wheeler. And if you're someone who runs in yoga therapy circles, then you probably know who Amy Wheeler is. If you don't, you're definitely in for a treat. I've had contact with Amy over the years, although we've never really met. But we've talked about her coming on the show a couple of different times, mostly back when she was on the board at the International Association of Yoga Therapists. But I'm kind of glad we waited, because she's no longer on the board, and we talked in the midst of this pandemic, and Amy is someone I see as having a very clear and empowering perspective on not just yoga, but on the profession of yoga, whether it's a yoga teacher or a yoga therapist, and on independent creators, essentially, being able to put out into the world what they have to put out into the world. And until we had this conversation, I didn't realize how much we have in common, how much we agree on. So it was really reaffirming and rewarding to connect with her, especially at this time with all that's going on. So I'm very excited that you're going to get to hear it today. Real quick before we do, I want to announce that next week, the second edition of the Jay Brown Yoga Practice videos is being released. Maybe some of you have purchased my practice videos in the past. I made them, it might have been maybe 6 or 7 years ago. Is it that long? I can't even remember, but it was some years ago. I put out a series of practice videos for people to use at home. They come in different lengths, so it's 7 minutes, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 60 minutes, and 75 minutes. And also there's different audio versions. So there's one with more teaching commentary and one with less teaching commentary. So you can turn me off some if you want. And while many people have used those videos, and I feel very good about having made them, some part of me always felt like there was one aspect that was missing, which is that those videos are just me doing the practice. And while I think that's potentially useful, I also found it problematic because it sort of made it seem like you should try to make it look like me. And that was not what I intended. So what we did is we shot a number of different people doing the same program. And the result is this wonderful example of how you can have a simple program of asana pranayama practice, and each person can have their own individual expression of that. They can make the choices that are right for them within that. And I feel very inspired by the video we made. We shot it at the end of last year before everything fell apart, and we just have been sort of not feeling like it was the right time to put it out. But now we finally finished the post-production on it, and I think it is the right time. I think it's a useful thing to be putting out into the world, and I'm happy to be doing that. If you're somebody who bought the practice videos in the past, you are going to have a very cheap opportunity to upgrade. If you haven't, you might wait till next week because that's when the second edition will be released. I'll mention it again next week too. I just wanted to give everybody a heads up about it. It is something new that I'm putting out, and I wanted to mention it. Lastly, let me also give some shout outs to our podcast premium subscribers, because without them, the show wouldn't be happening the way that it's happening. This week, let me say thanks to Jonah Sprout and Mike Huggins. Thank you, Jonah and Mike, and all of our podcast premium subscribers. If you don't know what I'm talking about, we have a podcast premium subscription, which not only gives you access to the complete archives of the show, but also is the best way to show your support. And there's a lot of options. It's a choose your rate. And if you can't afford anything at all, then just email us and we'll send you a free account. But if you listen to the show on the regular and you appreciate what you hear and you'd like to make a gesture of support, becoming a podcast premium subscriber is the best way to do it. You can find out about how to become a podcast premium subscriber, as well as my practice videos and all my other stuff, at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, like I said, keeping it brief, tooth got pulled yesterday. So we'll leave it there. I will touch base with you on the other side. But let's go ahead and get to this. Let's listen to this conversation that I had with Amy Wheeler. Are you there?
Hi, Jay, I am. I'm just shutting my windows so that I don't have any noise.
Oh, okay, that's good.
All right, I'm back.
All right, you can also, good morning. You could also turn off your video too.
Okay, sounds good. How are you today?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
I'm good.
Yeah.
It's a new world, right? All this not going out of the house, and
it sure is. It's actually one of the reasons why I said turn the video off too. Like one level, I think could get a better audio signal for the recording. So there's just like that technical thing. Although some people debate that, I find that sometimes if I'm just listening to someone's voice and I'm not looking at the screen, I feel like I'm listening better and more intimate, and I'm not so conscious of like a visual of us.
That's so interesting because I feel the opposite. I really study people's facial features and, when they're smiling, is it just their mouth or is it smiling with their eyes? And I feel like sometimes what's coming out of people's mouths is not congruent with what's happening inside of them. And so I like to have that additional feedback too.
Well, okay, you know what? Let's turn the video on.
No.
Now I want to turn the video on. Now that you said that, now I want to turn the video on.
Is that going to mess up our signal though?
No, I don't think so. I've debated that with people, but I don't have the best backdrop because I'll set up for recording. But it doesn't
Yeah.
matter. Well,
Nice to
actually,
see you.
nice to see you too. Hold on, we can take this down. I can have like an actual. See, if we're going to use the visual, then I feel like, oh, well, we should be conscious of that. I know you know this stuff because you yourself have been putting out all these great tips of late. Because it seemed to me like maybe you were somebody who also was already kind of online.
I was, and can I get you to put your mic closer now?
Oh yes, sorry about that.
See, I'm already being bossy. I'm sorry.
No, you're not being bossy. You're helping me make sure that my producer would have been so annoyed too, but you couldn't hear me. So thanks for mentioning it.
Yeah. So yeah, I've been online for probably about 4 years full time. And when I saw COVID come and the yoga industrial complex, as I call it, just blew up and everyone was scrambling, I thought, well, how can I be of service? It didn't cost me much time or energy or attention. I just could put out all these little tip sheets and little tiny videos just to say, okay, think about it this way, because it took me quite a long time with a learning curve and a husband who was into production to learn it all. It was not easy.
Yeah, I know. And I really appreciate it because there was other people putting out tips that I didn't think were such good tips. And your tips were right on point and really useful. I mean, again, because I was on a steep learning curve myself, also with the help of someone who understands production, my partner, Josh, who knows stuff about that I don't know, that helped me along the way too. But there, like you said, there is like a learning curve to using this medium. So in that moment of a bit of panic for everybody, to have some grounding things like, oh, this is how you should mute everybody when you're doing this, or, whatever those simple tips were. I was like, oh, that's super useful. So kudos to you for kind of, I think, really helping teachers out at a really pivotal moment.
Thank you. I literally wake up in the morning, and it usually happens in the shower. I just think, how can I be of service today? And if an idea pops in, I think, okay, I'll do that, So that's how it happened.
Very cool. Well, I'm also curious, and maybe we'll come back to this again later, but I'm curious, just before the pandemic hit, how much of your business was online and how much of it was relying on in-person teaching?
So all of my privates are online because I deal with mental health, and it makes it super easy to do online. And in fact, because most of my clients have trauma and anxiety and depression, they would feel more comfortable seeing me from their own home, the comfort without the drive and without the distraction and coming into a new place where they didn't feel comfortable. So 100% of my privates have always been online. And then I do as much of my yoga therapy school training as I possibly can. So at that time, it was only 300 of the 800 hours could be online, and I did every hour and more that I could. Now our yoga therapy school is 100% online because of COVID.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I mean, but prior, like in terms of, and I feel comfortable to ask you this only because you've been so transparent in your tips and you seem to share stuff. And if I cross a boundary, just say so. But I'm curious, like, even just in terms of percentages, how much of your income were you still doing in-person gigs? Like traveling or doing any like in-person gigs, or it was all online?
Not really. I mean, once in a while I would, but I had probably 8 places that I had gone to every year. You know how you go and you do the weekend and dog and pony show.
Yeah.
2 or 3 years ago, I quit all of them. I said, I'm so sorry. I don't want to travel anymore. I need to, keep my prana inward a little bit. And I didn't ever go back, and I didn't regret it for a day.
Very interesting. So you just switched over to all online. That's crazy. Because I switched over a lot of it. I would say about 50% of what I was doing went online, but I still was doing quite a bit of travel but slowly phasing that out too. It's interesting you say that, but I guess I find this online medium to be useful, but it does have its limitations as well. It's not the same as being in the same room with somebody.
So I have this conversation all the time, and I think for people with sensitive nervous systems, for people who are introverts, for people who've had trauma, I consider myself in all those categories. This is so much safer for me. My nervous system is not thrown out of whack. If I go into a room with 20 people, I pick up every single person and I feel too much. I have too much interoception. So what I was finding over all these years is that being in crowds and in public and just having people coming at me, I couldn't stay in balance. And it's only through this medium that I actually feel in balance for the first time in all of my teaching career, in fact.
That's so interesting. I mean, I guess what I was thinking, even if it was one-to-one teaching, like you didn't study with Desikachar via Zoom.
I didn't, but I would have been thrilled if I could have.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying there wouldn't have been a benefit, but would it have been the same as actually being in the same room, as in imbibing him in the way that you got to?
It's just totally different. I mean, the way that he would teach wasn't even about the content. It was about him putting you up in front of the class and humiliating you or whatever he wanted to do that day so you would get the life lesson. So, he was teaching in a totally different way than you and I are teaching, which is you've come to learn this content. Here's the syllabi. I'll teach you this on, Friday night, this on Saturday, this on Sunday. He wasn't really doing that. He was more like helping you see your flaws. Like I remember one time, it was the night that my husband and I got engaged, and we went over to the Krishnamacharya house, Desikachar house, and I didn't know it, but my husband had called ahead of time to say, Amy's coming over, but I have to go get her ring. And so Desikachar knew this, right? So I get there, and I didn't know where George had went. I was apologizing, he'll be here soon, and he was basically egging me on to throw my husband under the bus, right? And because he knew where George was, right? So that's the way he taught. He wanted to see if I'd throw my husband under the bus.
He wanted
on
to
the
see
on the night of our engagement.
He wanted to see if he should ask you to bury him or not, or something. or like, what do you think he was testing in you in that moment? What was he?
I think he wanted me to be humble and suck it up and say, we've had a problem today. I'm so sorry he's not here yet. Like he wanted me to take the responsibility for our inability to get there together and to show up as most people would show up when they're going to Mr. Desikachar's house, right?
Yeah.
And instead, there was this like, so why isn't he here? Are you upset that he's not here? Like kind of egging me on a little bit to see if I'd throw my husband under the bus, knowing he was about to propose to me.
And did you throw him under the bus?
No, not really. I mean, I was a little upset, but I didn't throw George under the bus. I just was kind of like, yes, we're doing the best we can, that kind of thing.
That's him. Like, that's very mischievous, isn't it?
Oh, he was so mischievous. I could tell you stories. That isn't what this podcast is about, but do you want one more story?
Well, but in a way it might be, because we will get to some things, but what you're describing and the way that he was teaching yoga, and a lot of people in the yoga therapy world kind of are inspired by Desikachar in many ways. So many people I've had on this show who I think are pioneers in the world of yoga therapy were students of his and very inspired by him. But what you're saying is that what he was doing is very different than what we're doing today.
Oh, completely. He was not teaching like we're teaching today. He was always looking for the lesson behind the content, right? So another example is I had just arrived in India. I knew nothing. I was a total newbie, and they were having one of his Saturday morning lectures. And he came up and said, hello, nice to meet you. And he said, you will be the judge of who's going to win the contest at the Saturday morning lecture. And I was thinking, well, I don't know anything. How could I possibly judge a contest? So we get there that morning, and there's, 50 people in the room. And the contest was who can describe the difference between vairagyam and viparyaya. Neither term did I know anything about, right? So I'm standing up there, and here is the judge, Miss Amy Wheeler from the United States. She has a PhD in psychology, right? And I'm just standing there like, okay, this is really weird. So anyway, the people are, do their debate, and then he says, basically, Amy, you will choose the winner. And I didn't know what to say. Instead of, I think what he wanted me to say is, I know nothing. I come here humbly, without any answers. Please, sir, I bow to your feet, or what, something of just admitting that I didn't know it. But I didn't do that. I was like, oh, that guy sounds good. And here's the worst part, Jay. He was like, oh, such a fabulous judge, such a fabulous answer, and how amazing. And I was kind of like, wow, I guess I had guessed the correct person, right? I go outside, the whole thing is over, and I say to my friend, wow, I'm surprised that I guessed the right person. And my friend looked at me and said, you didn't. So in front of 50 people, I guessed the wrong answer. Instead of humbly saying, I don't know, everyone left knowing I had guessed the wrong answer. And nobody said a word to me. That's Desikachar.
Wow, he didn't even let you know, and he figured you would find out.
Or not. I mean, a vidya is a vidya. We don't know what we don't know.
See, that's amazing to hear, like that process of learning, because that isn't like the yoga classes we have nowadays.
Right. So this is why I say, no, he wouldn't have taught on Zoom, probably. Yeah. But he didn't teach the way you and I teach anyway.
Right. Well, you mentioned that you had a PhD in psychology, and I read that you were in like doing sports psychology, right? At a pretty high level. And I'm curious about that, just as a little bit of a side, and maybe a little bit of like a context for other things that we might talk about today. Like in that work that you do, like for sports psychology, like how different is it than regular psychology? Like my gut feeling would be is in order to be effective in your sport, whatever that sport is, you would need to be well, and you need to have like a stable mind that you could focus on a thing and keep it there in a sustained attention way. Like it seemed like, is there something very specific when it comes to sports and the work that you were doing then?
Not at all.
Yeah.
And I'm not even doing psychology. I mean, maybe a little bit because I'm imbued with psychology. That's my lens, but I'm actually doing yoga therapy, and they think I'm doing sports psychology.
I see. So it's a branding thing in a way, right?
Well, this is what I tell all my students who are graduating from yoga therapy schools, which I know we're going to get into, is there's the doorway you get people to enter into your inner sanctum with, like, here, come in this door. And then when you get them in, of course, you deal with the whole person, the holistic nature, but you can't market that very well. You can't get people in the door. If I would say to, I work with a college golf team right now. If I were to say, come learn yoga therapy, you'll have better interoception. You can manage your breath and steady your mind. They would be like, no, we're not going to see her. Right? But as soon as we say, okay, here's a doorway, I'm going to help you with your golf game, boom, they are so in. They walk in the door, and then I do all the things I just listed.
Right. Right, because it absolutely will make you a better golfer. I know that because I played a little bit of golf in my life, and it does. All those things are what help you execute those activities more effectively.
100%. And a lot of it is exactly what you said. It's, are you getting enough sleep? How are you eating? How are you managing your classes and your stress? And is your girlfriend driving you crazy, or your boyfriend driving you crazy? Like just really human things that impact their game.
Right. And did you know that back then when you first became a sports psychologist? Like, did you think of it that way at the beginning? Or did that evolve as you got more into yoga, or did they happen simultaneously? Like, what came first for you? Were you into yoga before you became a psychologist, or I don't know, did it all happen together?
No, so I did sports psychology for almost 20 years before I flipped into yoga and yoga therapy. But even as a sports psychologist, I was very humanistic. So it was never about the performance or the outcome. It was always about, are you in balance? Who are you? What do you want out of this life? How can I help you to feel more confident in your skin? So it was kind of a natural evolution then to start doing yoga therapy with them, air quotes, because it's all the same ideas.
Right. And if you're focused on what helps people, then you end up doing the things that help people, regardless of what you label it. Right?
100%. And this is why you and I are talking today, because the yoga industrial complex has collapsed, as we know. And what are we going to rebuild? How are we going to help people outside the choir? Like, what we've been doing for so long is preaching to our own choir, but the world needs us. And how are we going to get to the general public out there and give them entryways or doorways that they feel comfortable coming in through? As I described the golfers coming in, because I can help them with their golf game. How are we going to help them come through the door so they can experience the fullness and the richness of what we have to offer?
I love the way that sounds. I guess before we get too into that, because we're going to dive deep into that momentarily, I am kind of curious a little bit about, you said you did 20 years as a sports psychologist and you had inklings, but eventually you did flip, as you said, to yoga. And I'm curious why you think that happened for you. And then maybe a little bit, because I've heard you talk about how you went from like an Iyengar approach and then you met Desikachar. And I'm always curious about that because they both say this is the yoga of Krishnamacharya, but they're not the same. So sometimes I'm curious, people who've had such direct experience, to speak to that. So again, first, your transition from being a psychologist to flipping to yoga, how does that happen?
So I have been a college professor throughout both lifetimes, and I had been, traveling around the world with different sports teams, a lot of Olympic type athletes and sports teams, and worked with the Los Angeles Lakers. And it seems so prestigious, but I have to tell you, it's not as great as it sounds. You're sitting in the hot sun on the bleachers for 12 hours a day, at world championships for 6 weeks of your summer, away from your family. I mean, and you don't get paid well. It's this resume builder, but because you get to travel with the high level teams, it's supposed to be this wonderful thing that they shouldn't have to pay you much for. So I've been doing that for quite a long time and realizing like, wow, this doesn't pay the mortgage. This keeps me away from my loved ones. And so I was kind of getting a little burnt out, not to mention, in the sporting community, they're so much about winning and I'm about human development. I do think a fully developed human will be more likely to win, but I just have a different, way to get there, I guess.
Yeah.
So when I first went to the Krishnamacharya Yoga Mandiram in 2001, it was the Silver Jubilee, which is the 25th anniversary of Krishnamacharya's passing. And it was a 3-week program, like an in-house where you stay in dorms and they feed you and you do all this great stuff all day, every day. And about 3 days into that, I felt different than I'd ever felt in my life. And now I know that feeling as sattva. That I felt light, I felt expansive, I felt like I was floating, I felt that I had no dukkha, no contraction of my heart space. And I called my parents from there and I said, I don't know what's going on, but I feel different. And once I got a taste of that, which I hadn't actually gotten from Iyengar, I got a lot of other things that I love from the Iyengar way of doing yoga, but I hadn't had that sukha in my heart. And I called my parents and I said, I don't know what's going on, but I've found my new calling. And literally on a dime, I came home and said, I'm doing something different with my life. We're done. Now, since then, all these sports athletes keep calling me and somehow I get sucked into it. So I do a little sports psych on the side, I'll just say.
Well, what was it? What do you think it was that in retrospect, because maybe at the time you didn't know, but maybe now you have a clearer perspective on what was it, do you think, that brought about that Satvic feeling? Like what was the missing ingredient?
Dinacharya. We got up, we, had our morning asana class, then we had a very Ayurvedic Satvic breakfast, then we would do a lecture class, then we would do pranayama, an actual formal pranayama class, then eat lunch. I mean, we just, every single day, we had this very structured thing that you just got up and did the next day, the next day, the next day. And I think my gunas got into balance.
And I would have to think, though, it also depends on what you were doing. Like,
yeah,
just having the structure. If you were doing stuff that was like wrecking your system in your physical practices, I'm saying, I'm curious about that too. I like that you're saying that idea of having kind of like a rituals that you follow with consistency over time.
Right. But the thing about the Desikachar way is that the goal of each practice, whether it's asana, pranayama, meditation, any practice you do, the goal is to get you in sattva. It's not to give you a workout. It's not to have you doing handstands. It's not to make you stronger or fitter. It is about the mind.
See, I have talked to a lot of people about Desikachar, and I've never heard anyone say it like that. That has been my experience too. And like my practice has become about that. And if I want other things, like other kinds of experiences or even like physicalities, like I'll do some squats or other things. But my asana pranayama practice, my hot practice as I think of it, is what you said. It's specifically about sattva.
Right. And he said to me, Amy, you're chubby. You need a workout. Go work out. But that's not what your yoga is for.
He said that?
Oh, yes. And specifically which body parts were chubby.
See, everybody talks about this sweet guy. Nobody talks about him making comments like that.
I don't know. He and I had a very special, I wasn't his personal student, but he always took time to interact with me. And, it's interesting at a friend's wedding, he came up to my husband and basically said, I see Amy's future and here's what it is, and laid it out. And I'm telling you, Jay, it is unfolding exactly how he said it, which I don't want to go into, but.
No, save that.
It's amazing to me, that he somehow, I think he saw me for what I am. Good and bad.
He just had a very clear lens that he was looking through, perhaps, and he could mirror those things back to you or something, right?
Yeah.
Or do you think he had some special insight? Was he like
no, he has special powers. He had city powers. There's no doubt. But I also, and I think I do this to a very small degree with my students, like you see what their blocks might be, like, oh, they've got a lot of fear or they've got a big ego. So I think he was trying to wake me up to my flaws so that maybe I could get a handle on them and live my true potential, my svadharma. And I have to say, like that episode I told you where I was the judge of the contest that I knew nothing about. I mean, this is how many years later? We're talking 20 years later, and it's still like yesterday. That had a big impact on me. Like, Amy, admit when you don't know something.
And did you ever have like a conversation with him about that later, or the lesson just exists within you and it's never talked about necessarily?
That's right.
So interesting. And so, okay, so you, at some point you have this experience, you come back, you say I'm changing my life, I'm doing this, whatever this is, but you're already been a sports psychologist for a long time. So when do you start telling people that it's yoga, or do you do further training? When does it start becoming yoga therapy? Or were they calling it yoga therapy when you were at the Krishnamacharya Yoga Mandiram for you? Yeah.
So I started learning yoga therapy in 2001 and have been, investing deeply in that and developing that ever since. It's just that my sports psych people still hang on and still want to work with me. Does that make sense? So they're like
Totally.
the last remnants of my old life, but they still, and I try to push them away, but they won't go away.
Because it works, right? Stuff works.
It really does.
Yeah.
I mean, I have to say it does.
Yeah, yeah. Very interesting. Okay, so 2001, that's pretty early in the world of yoga therapy. I didn't even become aware of it until more like 2007, maybe 2008. So who was running the show back then? Was John still the president at that time?
Are you talking about IOIT? Or are you talking?
Yeah.
About
I'm talking about IOIT.
So I didn't get involved in IOIT until 2007, 2008.
Oh, okay.
Time. I was doing yoga therapy, going back and forth to India every summer, long before IOIT kind of resurrected in 2007.
I see. And that was all through KYM?
Yeah.
Gotcha. Because they had a pretty rigorous program. I know I was friends with Chase Bossart early on, and I know he was making his trips and doing and he did some workshops at my place, and a bunch of people would show up because they would get credit for their training and stuff. I'm sorry that I have to ask this. I don't want to, but did you study with Kaustubh?
I did. And I was thinking this morning, I bet Jay's going to ask me this.
I don't want to, but I feel like I
talk about it. We have to.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I went through the whole, I started with the whole family in 2001, and, early on there were red flags, but of course you want to give people the benefit of the doubt. You don't really know what's happening. Nobody knows this, but I even wrote Desikachar a letter saying, here's the 6 things I think we all need to take a look at, right? So we all tried. We publicly tried to discuss these things. And then finally, I think 2011 is when the whole thing kind of fell apart, and most of us decided, okay, we tried for a decade. I don't like being detached from the KHYF or the KYM. And actually, I'm not detached from the KYM, but it was a necessary thing, unfortunately. And I know you've been through something similar in the last year. Gosh, you don't want to give up your connection, but at the same time, there comes a point where you just can't do it anymore.
Yeah, I also just think there's those issues because there is an institution around people too. It's not just individuals as well. And you you feel like if the people in charge of the institutions don't handle these situations or model the health and growth that you would think needs to happen or want to see, then you're in this weird precarious place where you learn these really valuable things from people who you don't feel like you can fully support anymore.
100%. And there's still, I'm sure you're having this too, there's still grieving around that.
Yeah.
I mean, it would be so nice if we could all go back to how it was and be a big, happy family.
I know. Well, it's interesting though, because it does seem like even when you described at the beginning the way Desikachar taught, he himself, from what I've heard from everybody I've spoken to, because of maybe what you described, he really seemed to avoid a lot of the kind of pitfalls in the way that because of the way he presented himself as this very not your guru situation.
Yeah. You know what I just have so deeply taken away from being in a relationship with him is the path forward is vairagyam. Detachment, surrendering, letting go, accepting what it is. There's no timeline for us to figure it out. There's only space for us to mess up and try to do better next time. And even with how he handled the 2011 and 2007, I don't even know what you want to call them, atomic bombs. He, even in that, was pretty hands off and just said, okay, it's what's going to happen is what's going to happen.
I know some people weren't happy about that.
I know. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying that was his way.
Yeah. And we also, later on, his health did deteriorate. So I know I heard people talk about how he sort of faded over time as well.
Yeah, there definitely came a point where he couldn't have done it if he wanted to, but very early on, he let it unfold.
Well, it's interesting when you talk about that. I only was in the same room with Desikachar once, and it was at a pretty big public event in New York. And it was just chanting, like a chanting thing that we all did with him, this big group of us. And there was this moment where he had Kaustubh up there, and he did the exact same thing that everybody describes, where he made him, demonstrate. And he talked a little bit about how Kaustubh had his own interpretation of this particular chant. And he was sort of praising that. And I remember thinking, oh, it's okay to have interpretations, that it wasn't, as opposed to other kind of systems or schools I had studied where you didn't hear them saying that. It was like, this is how it is. And especially when it came to chanting or Vedic chanting, is like really specific. And I know there are times when they do teach Vedic chanting in the Desikachar teachings, and they are pretty specific about how you're supposed to pronounce stuff. But at least in that moment, in that particular public display, he modeled that it was okay to have your own expression of these things, which I appreciated so profoundly.
I 100%, that is what I saw of him for the decade that I spent time with him. And I've heard since that a lot of the other high-level Krishnamacharya teachers actually do not appreciate that. They feel that that is almost like blasphemy. But that's what he said. He said, teach to the person in front of you. There's no dogma. There's no right way to do this. Don't hang on to the old ways. Actually meet the human being in front of you and speak their language and give them what will help them, and just be present to them. And, I've had critiques about this too, because I have been teaching at a university. So I've changed the teachings into a secular approach that 20-year-olds can understand. And it's not okay with a lot of people in the yoga world that really want that very strict way of teaching things.
That's what I'm curious about too, that, as you said, the way that we're teaching now isn't necessarily the way that you were taught. And I'm curious about that evolution of things. And because I learned some of the basic concept, inhale from above, exhale from below, like these Desikachar teachings. And I was doing them in my own personal practices and having all this transformative experience. But I was teaching power vinyasa classes and had a reputation for that. And I wanted to bring those things in, but just didn't think anybody was that's not what people were interested in. And I was too afraid to do it. But what I do now, in a way, is seeing if I could bring those kinds of one-to-one type principles into what we think of as a group yoga class, or a group vinyasa yoga class even. And how do you do that? So I'm kind of curious about your process of incorporating these principles into these different contexts. And I think that's been really valuable to me, to think of it as a toolbox, and that it can be applied in lots of different ways, and it isn't just one protocol or something.
Yeah, I feel like I've been blessed in that area because I don't teach in studios. I have college kids. That's really the only asana I teach. Sign up for a 12-week quarter or 15-week semester. And they're going to be in there and they're going to get what they get. And the first 3 weeks, because their minds and their bodies, usually the mind is rajas and the body is tamas, it's hell for them. They're like, this is too slow. This feels like Tai Chi. How come we're not doing power yoga? I can just see. But then there's a moment where they get it and they get into sattva. And after the first 3 weeks, they're totally into anything I want them to do. So if that was a studio class, the people just wouldn't come back after the first time. But since they have to be there for a grade and it's too late to change classes, they're forced into it. And then they realize
Nice.
oh my God, this is amazing.
Nice. Let's see. That's a very, in a way, enjoyable teaching experience to be in. Although I've heard that same situation talked about where people have to be there. If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.